Roy Stryker, Photography, and the Great Depression. If it hadn't been for Roy Stryker, a priceless collection of photographs from the Great Depression would no longer exist. It was Stryker who assembled a talented group of photographers, inspired them to great work, and fought fiercely to preserve their photo legacy. Stryker made sure the files of more than 170,000 of their photos and negatives found safe haven in the Library of Congress. In 1935, the middle of America's greatest economic collapse, a group of President Roosevelt's advisors, known as the Brain Trust, set up an agency to help farmers. It was called the Farm Security Administration, or FSA. From the beginning, FSA administrators realized magazine and newspaper photographs showing needy farmers would boost the chances that New Deal relief legislation would pass Congress. The development of this photo collection and its distribution to the print media was the job of the FSA's historical section, headed by its idealistic director, Roy Emerson Stryker. I was pretty unsophisticated when I took that job as far as how to pick a photographer. Let's be very honest about it. In that job and elsewhere, I began to realize it was curiosity. It was a desire to know. It was the eye to see the significance around them. Very much what a journalist or good artist is what I looked for. And above all else, a sincere, passionate love of people and respect for people. Roy Stryker. During the heyday of the historic section, Stryker and his team of photographers wanted to do more than just simply document unemployed Americans, dusty farms, and long bread lines. These photographers wanted to capture genuine emotion and produce an evocative historical record for succeeding generations. They roamed the back roads of America, knowing they would find unforgettable images of suffering people. But they hoped to find more. Their efforts were rewarded. They found that despite deprivation and hunger, Americans held fast to their pride and individualism. These were the traits that got Americans through the Great Depression. What impels me to click the shutter is not what things look like, but what they mean. Jack Delano, FSA photographer. Raised on his father's Colorado cattle ranch, Stryker was a serious high school student and later a successful engineering undergraduate at the Colorado School of Mines. But like his father, Roy was a populist. Colorado offered limited choices for a young man interested in social reform. Columbia University had a more relevant curriculum, and New York City promised excitement and opportunity. With almost no funds, and on a whim, Stryker packed his new wife Alice and himself onto the train and headed east. The couple supported themselves working with orphan children at New York's Union Resettlement House. But Stryker grew restless. He saw the children were victims of larger problems in society, and he needed to find a better way to help. After infantry service in World War I, he entered Columbia to get his degree and a better job, allowing him opportunity to reform society. He threw himself into the study of economics. Stryker got his baccalaureate and stayed on as a graduate student under his mentor and graduate advisor, economist Rexford Tugwell, who later joined Roosevelt's Brain Trust. Events at Columbia shaped the rest of Stryker's career. Tugwell needed help assembling photographs for his new economic textbook called American Economic Life. He asked Stryker if he wanted the job. He could either pay him or put his name on the book as co-author. Stryker chose to become an author, thinking it was a better career move. The book broke new ground as an illustrated textbook. Profoundly moved by its reproductions of Lewis Hines' images of abusive child labor practices, Stryker thought Tugwell's illustrated book was a visual reality check. The book inspired him to make changes in the way he taught economics as a graduate teaching assistant. What followed was a suggestion from one of his professors that changed Stryker's career forever. Economics professor John Koss suggested that Stryker take students on walks around New York City instead of keeping them in the classroom. Koss wanted the students to see with their own eyes the squalor Jacob Riis had pictured in his book, How the Other Half Lives. Stryker easily embraced the idea. With his students in tow, Stryker visited tenements, walked picket lines, and attended union meetings. He became convinced it was better to see what textbooks merely described. Stryker's student walks were enormously popular and became part of Columbia's required curriculum. Stryker's career was now set. To make people understand social conditions in need of change, you had to show photographs and charts, anything to illustrate what you wanted people to understand. Stryker had found the passion of his life, what came to be called documentary photography, and this was a man who had taken very few pictures himself. He would become an advocate for documentary photography and an organizer of photo projects with a social purpose. This was going to be his life's work. When Tugwell went to Washington to join the New Deal, he asked Stryker to come with him. Tugwell knew Stryker was the perfect man to run the new FSA's historical section. When the file began to grow, the things brought in were fresh and exciting. I was particularly interested in pictures. And the files grew because pictures demanded more pictures. It was like a man who started taking narcotics. I liked it. I needed more. I was paid to get an education. That was fantastic. And sure, I had my limitations. I look back and I don't see how in the hell I ever survived, or how we ever got where we were. Stryker was a populist and idealist, not a propagandist. His vision of what the historical section should do was far beyond the production of images supporting New Deal policies. He thought that if he could just hire the right photographers, his section might make a record of American history people could actually see and feel. Stryker was right. As the photo collection grew, the unmistakable conclusion was clear. Americans were getting through their misery by holding fast to their pride. They refused to give up. For example, many Dust Bowl families left the hardest hit areas, but many doggedly held onto their farms through the decade of repeated dust storms, constant famine, and profound heartbreak. For many families, the only source of nourishment was brine-soaked tumbleweed. Children and the elderly, already weakened by malnutrition, were especially vulnerable to what was called dust pneumonia. In this decade before penicillin, many died of this condition. For the Dust Bowl mothers, maintaining a clean home was a heroic struggle. Every day, dust blew through the cracks in doors and windows. The women swept out the dust, usually an all-day job, only to start all over the next storm. The photos taken by the FSA photographers showed that through all this suffering, Americans stood fast and clung to the hope better times would come. This was the paradox of the Great Depression, revealed by the FSA images. Bureaucrats hoped the FSA photos would show Americans broken by poverty, only to be restored to their jobs and homes by New Deal relief checks. Instead, they saw undaunted courage, fierce optimism, and a determined individualism, even in the face of economic ruin. Many Americans were too proud to accept government help. I found that a kind of individualism existed among the people, an inability to conform, a desire to be master of their own fate. The one thing I found in traveling through the United States was that every man and every woman was different. Arthur Rothstein, FSA photographer. The photographers Stryker assembled had a range of talent and experience. But Stryker, ever the teacher and organizer, ensured that the group grew professionally by encouraging them to review each other's work when they met in Washington during their periodic conferences with him and the other photographers. After the Washington meetings, Stryker would give each photographer a new assignment, complete with a syllabus of detailed information about the people and the terrain they would photograph. Inspired, the FSA photographers set off to parts of America sometimes completely new to them. Because these photographers moved around during these assignments, they were mostly out of touch with the FSA. The Washington conferences with Stryker became an essential tool to coordinate their efforts and maintain the quality of their images. In addition to money for meals, gasoline, and hotels, the photographers were provided with a car, a camera, and film. Each of them was expected to return unprocessed film by mail to Washington for development in the FSA photo lab. When I began to use my 35mm camera, I was never separated from it. I wore it often under my jacket, on my shoulder like a weapon in a holster. I always had the feeling that something was going to happen in front of me, and when it did, I wanted my camera to be there. Carl Meidens, FSA photographer. FSA photographers used a range of cameras from small, lightweight models to the larger, heavier cameras requiring a tripod or a very steady hand. New in the 1930s were the Leica and Contax, holding 35mm roll film. These smaller cameras with film that could be quickly advanced during rapid shooting were favored by FSA photographers who had been photojournalists. Other FSA photographers who consider themselves professional photo artists favored the big cameras with a 4x5-inch or 8x10-inch sheet film. The Speed Graphic was a camera taking a range of film from 2¼ by 3¼ to 5x7 inches. It was the favorite of both photojournalists and photo artists. The size of the negative determined the quality of the print, and print quality was critical to photographers who thought of themselves as serious photo artists, who looked forward to their work being shown in such museums as New York's Museum of Modern Art. In 1938, the FSA had its first major exhibition at the International Photographic Show at Grand Central Palace. The reviews were mixed, but mostly very good. This show, and the wide distribution of the FSA images in magazines and newspapers, cemented the reputation of the historical section and its photographers. Let's face it, I had a group of people I learned I could trust implicitly. They all had that fine sense of judgment. The greatest thing I can say is that at no time did any photographer try to be cute, to ridicule, to take advantage, to in any way show anything but respect for the person he was photographing. Roy Stryker. When he left government to join Standard Oil in 1943 as a photo archivist and director of photography, Stryker employed some of his former photographers. At Standard Oil, the photos were used to promote the commercial interests of the company. Stryker's father had thought Standard Oil was one of the major evils of American society. The younger man must have welcomed the work and the continuation of his photo mission with some ambivalence. Eventually, Stryker made certain the photos were preserved by transferring them to the photo archives of the University of Louisville. In 1950, Stryker joined Pittsburgh's Carnegie Museum to organize and archive photos documenting the renaissance of the Smoky City to a modern industrial giant. The archive was eventually transferred to the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh for safekeeping. After he left the Pittsburgh project in 1960, Stryker worked briefly for Jones and Laughlin Steel Company, directing a documentation project. Later on, he accepted various consulting jobs and conducted seminars on photojournalism at the University of Missouri. He returned to the West and died in Grand Junction, Colorado in 1975. Toward the end of his life, Roy Stryker was interviewed by the Smithsonian Institution from 1963 to 1965. Reflecting on his FSA work, he admitted how little he really knew about photography and how much the photographers he had hired taught him. He learned that images could express feeling as well as information. I learned you had to grow into this. I had none of this when I started in. Your sophistication, your knowledge, your experience, you grow tremendously. I am a far, far different guy. There would have been something wrong with me if I hadn't turned into a different man. Roy Stryker.